So this was a case out of New Mexico. This guy, the defendant, Cardenas, he was at home, and his buddy, I'll pronounce it as Lujan, his buddy came to the defendant's home, opened a screen door, started banging on the door loud enough to wake up the defendant. This was 1:30 a.m. at night. The defendant armed himself, demanded that the visitor identify himself. Maybe these are friends, so maybe Lujan didn't hear him. But the defendant didn't hear an answer. The intruder continued pounding on the door, and the defendant fired a single shot through the front door, killed his friend, Lujan, without knowing it was his friend. He was tried for voluntary manslaughter. This would be reckless manslaughter. He requested jury instruction on defensive habitation and involuntary manslaughter. The district court denied the instructions, and he was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. He now appeals his conviction, asserting the district attorney the district court committed error when it refused those instructions. I'm going to focus here on the defensive habitation instruction because it's along the lines of what we have for Texas. That he was dealing with an unlawful forcible intruder in his home, and therefore it should be legally presumed that he had the privilege to use deadly defensive force. The district court refused to give that instruction on the grounds that it was not an actual attempt to break into the home by an intruder. In fact, it was just his friend trying to get his attention. And the district court, the trial court, said, no, you only get the benefit of the legal presumption if it's an actual attempt to unlawfully and forcibly break in. It doesn't matter if you simply believed it was an unlawful attempt to break in. It doesn't matter if your belief was reasonable. It doesn't matter what your perception of it was. The most reasonable belief that you were dealing with an unlawful and forcible intrusion is irrelevant unless it turns out to be correct. No reasonable mistakes here. It has to be an actual unlawful intrusion. And that's why the trial court refused to give the defensive habitation instruction, because this was, in fact, the guy's friend who was banging on the door, not an intruder. And the defendant appealed this, claimed this error, and the appellate court thankfully said that it doesn't have to be an actual attempt to intrude, that a reasonable perception of intrusion is enough, and that there was evidence to support that belief. So the belief was not irrational on the part of this defendant. There was evidence to support the belief. There was evidence indicating the victim was in the process of opening the door when he was shot. Expert testimony suggested that the door could have been anywhere between 1 and 4 inches open when the defendant fired the fatal shot. There was no evidence the defendant himself opened the door, so it's reasonable to infer that the victim did. One of the investigating officers testified he believed that the victim was trying to gain entry, blah, blah, blah. Lots of evidence. Now, the appellate court's not deciding whether or not this evidence is true. They're just saying there was evidence to support the argument, the defensive habitation argument, that a reasonable occupant inside the dwelling could have perceived an unlawful and forcible entry. And as long as there's facts to support a jury instruction, well, then it's up to the jury to decide whether or not they believe those facts. And they should be given that jury instruction. So, as is generally the case here, the appellate court is not saying, well, this guy should be acquitted. They're just saying, listen, there was evidence to support the jury instruction. The jury should have been given the instruction. It's up to them to decide whether or not they believe this argument. And they were not given that opportunity at the trial. So we're going to reverse the conviction, not let this guy go free, not announce him not guilty, reverse the conviction. Let's see. Yeah. Well, it doesn't say here, but generally they're reversing the conviction and remanding for a new trial. And in the new trial, the jury would be given that instruction. So here we have a trial court in New Mexico where the trial court said, no, it doesn't matter if you reasonably perceived an intrusion, it has to have been real. And then the trial court was reversed by the appellate court, said, no, reasonable perception of an intrusion is sufficient. We have a very different case. You may remember the case of Theodore Wafer in Detroit, Michigan. If you don't, we'll go over the facts real quick in this decision. So November 2nd, 2013, and this was a trial that I covered in real time, every minute of it. November 2nd, 2013, 4:30 a.m., the defendant, Theodore Wafer, shot and killed 19-year-old Renisha McBride on the front porch of the defendant's home. McBride had been in a car accident before the shooting, almost certainly extremely drunk. It's uncertain how or why she came to be at the defendant's home. She probably thought it was a friend's home, and they were joking with her, not letting her in. She had marijuana in her system, and a blood alcohol level was 0.218, folks. And the trauma of having crashed her car. They found her crashed car a block or so away. 0.218, that's about 3 times the legal limit. So, a defendant admitted that he shot McBride. In fact, he called the police immediately after the shooting, but he asserted at trial that he did so in self-defense because he thought McBride was trying to break into his home. However, the evidence showed that McBride was not armed at the time of the shooting. Well, that would be irrelevant, right? That's completely irrelevant to whether or not she was attempting to break into the home. She possessed no burglary tools. Well, that's irrelevant. You don't need... These two guys we just saw in the video, they didn't have burglary tools. Were they trying to break in? They sure were. The jury convicted defendant of second-degree murder, statutory involuntary manslaughter, and felony firearm. The trial court sentenced the defendant 15 to 30 years for the second-degree murder conviction and 7 to 15 years for manslaughter. This would be another issue on appeal, by the way, that he got convicted of murder and manslaughter, because those are really two different killings, and there was only one victim here. Murder requires malice, and manslaughter requires an absence of malice. So how do you get both? Spoiler, ultimately, the Michigan Supreme Court would reverse on the manslaughter conviction, leaving only the murder conviction, because it was an irrational decision. But the Court of Appeals would allow it, would allow for both. This same Court of Appeals decision we're looking at right now. So the defendant argues that the trial court committed error when it denied Wafer's request for jury instruction based on Michigan Consolidated Law 780-951, Section 1. This is the legal presumption in the context of highly defensible property. Very similar law to what we just saw in Texas. The difference is Michigan's law is a lot more ambiguous about whether or not reasonable belief is sufficient, reasonable belief of an intrusion. And what this Court of Appeals decides is that no, reasonable belief is not enough. It has to be an actual breaking and entering into the dwelling. And they decide, because Renisha McBride was not in possession of burglary tools, that there was no actual attempt to break and enter, and therefore Wafer doesn't get the benefit of the defensive habitation presumption. Now, in fact, I'll tell you, there was evidence consistent with the breaking and entering. So Renisha McBride was banging on the front door of Wafer's home, 4:30 a.m. Very violent part of Detroit, by the way. Lots of home invasions in this community. Wafer had reason to be concerned about home invasion. In fact, he kept a shotgun nearby, a pistol grip Mossberg shotgun. He was asleep in his Barca-lounger in his living room, not far from the front door. So he wakes up due to this pounding. He's concerned. He grabs his shotgun. He goes to his front door. There's a pause in the banging. He opens up his front door, and he testifies someone lunges in the direction of the door, and that's when he fires the shotgun in self-defense and defense of habitation. Turns out to be the drunk Renisha McBride at the wrong home. Obviously, 12 gauge to the face, kills her instantly. Well, the evidence would show that there was the front door, and then there was a screen door, and the screen on the screen door had been punched inward, not outward by the shotgun blast, but inward. Well, that's breaking and entering. That's a forcible attempt to enter the home unlawfully. So there was actually evidence to support. But what the Court of Appeals decides is, well, we believe she was just a drunk girl not actually trying to break into the home. So we're going to ignore that screen door evidence. And if she wasn't actually trying to break in, it doesn't trigger this legal presumption under Michigan law. So Wafer should not have gotten the instruction. The trial court was correct, and his convictions, the Court of Appeals says, for both of these is correct. Now, Wafer would then appeal to the Michigan Supreme Court, and the Michigan Supreme Court it's interesting that they have two different decisions. One in 2018, where the majority of the court just says, no, we agree with everything the Court of Appeals said. There was a dissent by one justice on the Michigan Supreme Court on this issue of whether or not the breaking in has to be actual or only reasonably perceived. And that dissent does an excellent job of explaining why reasonable belief should be the standard. And why it would apply in this case, why reasonable belief is enough. By the way, I'm going to put links to all these decisions in the description of today's show for Law of Self-Defense members when the blog post version of this goes up. If you're not a member, you can look this stuff up yourself. Sorry, that's another benefit of being a Law of Self-Defense member. So that dissent said, no, reasonable belief should be enough under Michigan law. But that is a dissent. So the Michigan Supreme Court, right now in Michigan, you don't get the benefit of that legal presumption of a reasonable fear of imminent deadly force harm, someone's breaking into your home, unless it's an actual attempt to break in. Reasonable perception is not enough because of these Michigan cases. So there we are with Michigan. Now, why is that a bad idea? It's a bad idea because everywhere else in use of force law, reasonable perception is sufficient. Now, it used to be different, especially in the context of defense of others. So it was very common 50 years ago, 80 years ago, in a defense of others situation. So you're not defending yourself, you're defending others. Remember, we have the same 5 elements. Framework applies in both defense of self and defense of others. Defense of yourself, it was always the case that reasonable perception was sufficient. You didn't have to be correct about these things. So if you were threatened with a fake gun that couldn't actually kill you, but you reasonably perceived it as a real gun, you're making a mistake, right? You think you're facing a real gun, but you're not. But if it's a reasonable mistake, that's fine. Reasonable mistakes are okay in defense of self. It used to be different for defense of others. It used to be that in the case of defense of others, about half the states would say, if you come to someone else's defense and it turns out you were mistaken in your perception about what was going on, that mistake is okay if it's a reasonable mistake. So you turn a corner, you see two scruffy looking guys grabbing a woman and she's screaming for help. Help me, I'm being kidnapped, I'm going to be raped. And kidnap and rape are deadly force offenses. If it was happening to you, you could use deadly force in self-defense. So you whip out your pistol, you take those guys at gunpoint to save that woman. But then it turns out those 2 scruffy guys are not kidnappers and rapists. They're 2 undercover DEA agents making a lawful arrest. Well, under the reasonable perception standard, if you could not have known that, there's no badges displayed, that kind of thing. As long as your perception of a kidnapping and rape was reasonable, even if mistaken, well, then your defense of others was still good and you're free of criminal liability. But there was also another standard called the alter ego standard that did not allow for reasonable mistakes. The alter ego standard said that your privilege to use force in defense of that other person is only as great as their own privilege. Well, under the alter ego standard, because that woman would have no privilege to use force to resist a lawful arrest, you would have no privilege to use force on her behalf, no matter how much you reasonably believed a kidnapping and rape was taking place. All that would matter would be the actual facts. Every state has done away with that standard and switched over to reasonable perception being the appropriate standard. Why? Because it's the only thing we can ever use to guide our conduct, folks. Nobody ever knows truth in an absolute sense. We're all always relying on our perceptions, and all we can ask is that people use reasonable perceptions. Not have some omniscient, ultimate, perfect understanding of truth. None of us have that. It's impossible. So in defense of others, every state has gone away with that rigid, alter ego, no mistakes allowed approach. You're allowed to make mistakes in defense of others as long as your mistake is a reasonable mistake. And as we saw in Texas, with the legal presumption of a reasonable fear of imminent deadly force harm in the context of defense of your castle, the question is whether you knew the intrusion was happening or you had reason to believe. So it has to be reasonable. Can't be a speculative fear that there's an intrusion. There have to be facts to which you're applying your powers of reason. But if there are, and you evaluated those facts in a reasonable way, even if it later turns out you were mistaken, that's sufficient. So this Michigan decision is going completely counter to this decades-long trend of moving away from requiring absolute correctness to requiring a reasonable assessment of what's happening. Why? Well, this was a highly politicized and racially energized case. Theodore Wafer was white in his home. Renisha McBride was a young black woman in Detroit. So all the usual suspects came out. The prosecution made a lot of reprehensible arguments in this case, really suggesting that Theodore Wafer was just, he was angry at the black people for living in his neighborhood, and here was another black person who woke him up and he was going to make her pay. Those are the kind of arguments that were made. And then, of course, there are all the usual protests and all the usual implicit violence and danger to the jurors if they don't convict. And all of those political and racially energized pressures also applied to judges. Judges have to worry about the political consequences of their decisions too. We see that in many, many cases that we cover, these high-profile cases. And the Court of Appeals is not going to be immune to that, particularly since the Court of Appeals eventually, they would like to be on the Michigan Supreme Court, right? So if they're ever nominated, they don't want the press to start talking about how they saved that racist Theodore Wafer who killed a young black woman just because he was in a bad mood. And of course, the Michigan Supreme Court wants to protect their legacy too. There was that one brave member of the Michigan Supreme Court who did actual substantive legal analysis on this question of, do you have to be right about the intrusion, or is reasonable belief enough? The other members of the Michigan Supreme Court wrote not one word on that issue. What does that tell you?